To understand the weight of this situation, you first have to understand who Anthony Edwards is right now and what his profile looks like in the broader basketball world. Ant is not just a Minnesota Timberwolves player. He is the face of the franchise, a four-time All-Star, one of the most electrifying athletes in the sport, and increasingly talked about as the next central figure of the entire NBA. He entered the league as the #1 overall pick in 2020, and in the years since he has done nothing but validate that selection. His scoring ability is elite, his athleticism operates on a different tier. His playoff performances have elevated him into genuine superstar territory, and his personality has made him one of the most marketable young athletes on the planet. In 2023, he signed a 5-year contract extension with the Timberwolves worth more than $200 million. And with endorsement deals layered on top of that, his financial profile sits in a completely different stratosphere than the average professional. He has become one of the recognizable faces the league leans on when it markets itself to a younger audience. And that visibility only amplifies everything that happens in his personal life. He entered the NBA with the first overall pick designation and a mandate to become something special. And by every measurable standard, he has delivered on that mandate. His scoring averages, his playoff games, his highlight moments all point toward a player who was already operating at the level of the sport's biggest names. But the personal version of his story has been running alongside the basketball story at equal volume, and in this particular stretch of the offseason, it arguably produced more conversation than anything happening on the court. When someone at that level of fame and earning power gets pulled into a public legal battle involving money and family, the story does not stay quiet. It becomes a cultural event. And that is exactly what happened when the details of this child support case started reaching the public. Aisha Howard is the woman at the center of this particular dispute. She is an Instagram influencer and social media personality who also shares a son with Atlanta rapper Lil Baby, giving her an existing public profile before her name became linked to Edwards. The two share a daughter named Aubrey Summer, who was born in October 2024. From the moment the birth was confirmed and the legal proceedings began, the case attracted enormous attention because of the financial stakes involved and the sharply different legal standards that exist between the states where both parties sought to litigate. Howard filed a child support petition in California in September 2024, shortly before giving birth. Edwards then filed a paternity and child support action in Georgia. And right there in that split filing decision, the foundation of the entire legal battle was established. Two states, two sets of rules, two very different financial outcomes potentially on the table, and a months-long fight to determine which one will control the final number. A court-ordered DNA test confirmed in December 2024 that Edwards was the father, and from that point forward, both sides dug in. Edwards made clear through his legal filings that he was not interested in custody or visitation. The only question he wanted the court to settle was financial, and he wanted that question settled in Georgia on his terms. The original disagreement over child support was not subtle. During the proceedings, Edwards had been voluntarily paying $5,000 a month, but Howard was pushing to take that number all the way up to $20,000 per month as the permanent court-ordered amount. That figure became an immediate topic of widespread discussion the moment it entered public circulation. On one side of the conversation, people pointed to Edwards' contract and argued that a player earning tens of millions of dollars per year should be expected to provide at a level that reflects his income. On the other side, people questioned whether $20,000 monthly reflected actual childcare costs, or whether the number was calibrated to capture a percentage of Edwards' wealth. The debate played out across sports pages, entertainment outlets, and comment sections across the internet, and it framed the entire case in terms of not just family law, but fairness, wealth, and accountability. What most people watching from the outside did not fully grasp yet was that the fight over how much would ultimately be determined almost entirely by the fight over where. Jurisdiction in family law is not a procedural technicality. It is a foundational variable that can change the entire financial outcome of a case, especially when the person being asked to pay earns at the level Anthony Edwards earns. Every state has its own child support guidelines, its own statutory formulas, and its own framework for how a high-income earner's obligations are calculated. California, which is where Howard initially filed, operates under a system that factors in each parent's net disposable income, the percentage of custodial time, and various additional expenses. For someone with Edwards' earning profile, That calculation can produce numbers that far exceed what might be ordered in other states. Georgia, by contrast, operates under a different income shares model that applies more standardized calculations, regardless of how high the income goes. Edwards' legal team understood this distinction clearly. They filed in Georgia, argued consistently that California lacked personal jurisdiction over Edwards, and pushed back on every attempt by Howard's side to keep the case there. Howard's attorneys countered by accusing Edwards of intentionally concealing California-based financial assets to avoid fighting a case in that state. It was a conflict not just over money, but over which legal framework would govern the entire outcome. The courtroom battle played out across both coasts and stretched across multiple filings, competing arguments, and judicial rulings over the course of more than a year. A California judge sided with Edwards in March 2025, ruling that the state could not determine his child support obligations. That was a critical moment because it validated the argument his team had been making from the start. Howard pursued the matter further, but that effort also unraveled. By the time the Georgia proceedings concluded, the outcome was decisive. The judge ordered Anthony Edwards to pay $3,222 per month in child support for Aubrey Summer. The judge also noted in the court documents that Howard did not appear at trial and provided no evidence to support her claims. That detail compounded the legal defeat significantly because it meant the Georgia court issued its ruling without any competing evidence from Howard's side to balance the record. When you compare $3,222 per month against the $20,000 per month that had been sought, the difference is not a rounding error. It is a transformation of the entire financial obligation on a long-term basis. Over the course of a single year, that gap represents more than $200,000. Over several years, it compounds into a figure that reshapes the entire financial picture of the arrangement. There was one more dimension to the California proceedings that added an extraordinary layer to the outcome. While the Georgia case was concluding, a Los Angeles judge formally dismissed Howard's separate California child support filing entirely. But the judge went further than a simple dismissal. The court declared Howard a vexatious litigant, a legal designation that carries real consequences and formally restricts that person's ability to file future claims in that jurisdiction without court permission. For Howard's California strategy, which had been built on the argument that Edwards' business ties to the state were sufficient to establish jurisdiction, that designation represented a complete legal collapse. Edwards' attorneys had argued from early in the proceedings that Howard had filed in California specifically in hopes of securing a larger financial award, and that her jurisdictional claims were without merit. The California court ultimately agreed entirely. Before the final rulings landed publicly, it is worth understanding just how much money had already changed hands during the litigation process. Edwards had been making child support payments since January 2025, starting with an initial payment of $20,000 and then following that with $5,000 monthly payments continuing through the date of trial. By the time the Georgia judge issued the final order, Edwards had paid a total of $110,000 in support payments. That context matters because it demonstrates that Edwards was not avoiding financial responsibility during the legal proceedings. He was paying consistently throughout the entire dispute, even as the jurisdictional battle continued. The court's final ruling set the permanent monthly figure at $3,222 going forward, derived from Georgia's child support guidelines using the income information provided by both parties. Howard's monthly income was listed at zero in the court filings, which became another significant point of public discussion when the details became widely known. When the ruling dropped publicly, Aisha Howard went live on Instagram and broke down emotionally over what had just happened. Clips from the live spread rapidly and content creators immediately picked up the footage, framing it as her crime over losing the high-stakes financial battle she had been building toward for over a year. The moment resonated because it was unfiltered. This was not a prepared press statement or a carefully worded Instagram caption. It was a woman reacting in real time to a court outcome she clearly felt was deeply unjust. And that raw quality is exactly what made the footage spread the way it did. She called the online narrative deeply troubling and accused certain media blogs of being paid to spin narratives protecting Edwards' reputation, arguing that much of what was being published was entirely false and disconnected from reality. Her delivery was raw and frustrating, and it immediately became one of the biggest talking points surrounding the entire case. She also addressed the outcome directly, pointing out that the Georgia monthly figure was actually lower than the $5,000 Edwards had been voluntarily paying during the proceedings, framing the ruling as a step backward rather than a resolution. The live video spread fast, the reactions piled up, and the story that had been building in courtrooms for over a year suddenly had a viral emotional moment attached to it that pulled in an entirely new audience who had not been following the case from the beginning. What made Howard's response particularly striking was the direction she took it beyond her own personal circumstances. She referenced statistics from the United States Census Bureau on the prevalence of fatherless households among black children and framed her experience as part of a larger systemic pattern. She described what she called the normalization of absent fathers and the lack of parental accountability, writing that the community often inadvertently applauds behavior that keeps black children at the highest percentile of living in single-parent households. Those words elevated the conversation from a celebrity dispute into something that touched genuine social questions resonating with a wide audience. By pivoting away from the specific numbers in the ruling and toward a broader cultural argument, Howard effectively changed the terms of the debate. She was no longer just a woman who lost a child support case. She was a mother raising a larger point about how society responds when powerful men use legal systems to minimize their financial obligations, while remaining absent from their children's lives. Some people responded with sympathy and agreed that the larger pattern she described was real regardless of the specific financial outcome in her case. Others argued the court had already spoken and the ruling reflected the facts presented to the judge, not a failure of accountability. But even the people who disagreed with her could not ignore the force of the argument she was making, and that tension kept the conversation running far longer than the initial ruling would have sustained on its own. Howard also made a direct allegation that Edwards had never signed the birth certificates of the children he fathered outside of his relationship with Shannon Jackson, and had never met them. She stated that a man can take the jersey off his back and shoes off his feet to sign for fans, yet his own 3 children are missing that same signature on their birth certificates and have never even met him. She also refuted the characterization of the mothers in this situation as having filed for support, writing that none of them filed initially and that the father took each mother to court himself, choosing legal maneuvers over showing up for his children. Those specific claims reignited the public debate about Edwards' conduct as a father, entirely separate from the financial question the court had already resolved. They also forced the conversation into territory that no court ruling can settle. A judge can set a monthly payment. A judge cannot order a parent to be present, to sign a birth certificate, or to be part of a child's life. And Howard made it clear that in her view, the legal outcome and the human outcome were 2 completely different things. That distinction became the most emotionally charged part of the entire conversation, and it is the part that lingered longest in public discussion after the courtroom chapter officially closed. Anthony Edwards' reaction did not require a press conference or a statement. It was the kind of response that made clear he was completely unbothered. While Howard was on live venting about false narratives and blasting blogs, Edwards' legal team had already spent months systematically shutting down demands that went well beyond monthly child support. At one point, Howard's side had pushed for a $500,000 lump sum payment on top of ongoing support, and had even demanded a public online apology from Edwards. His legal team dismissed both. The courts backed that position entirely. So by the time the Georgia judge issued the final order, Ant did not need to say a word. Records from the Minnesota official marriage system confirmed that Anthony Jermel Edwards and Shannon LaSae Jackson filed marriage paperwork on July 16th in Hennepin County, Minnesota. Edwards appeared at Fanatics Fest in New York the following day, wearing a ring on his left hand, looking completely at ease while Howard's emotional live video was still circulating everywhere. Winning in court, getting the $500,000 demand thrown out, keeping the monthly number at $3,220, and then showing up to a major public event newly married and visibly unbothered created a moment that the internet could not stop talking about. Sports pages, entertainment blogs, and fans who had been following the case understood immediately that the convergence of those 2 storylines produced a wave of commentary that kept everything trending simultaneously. Shannon Jackson herself had been a quiet but constant presence throughout the entire Edwards saga. The 2 had been dating since 2020, went public with their relationship gradually over the years, and welcomed a daughter named Aislinn together in March 2024. Throughout the Aisha Howard legal proceedings, the public accusations, and the sustained commentary about Edwards' personal life, Jackson remained largely silent publicly. She did not issue statements responding to court filings. She did not engage with social media commentary about the other paternity situations. She stayed beside Edwards through the most scrutinized period of his personal life without making a story about herself. And when the marriage confirmation became public, many people interpreted her steadiness throughout the controversy as the defining context for why the relationship had reached that milestone, even while the legal battles were still generating headlines. Edwards himself has 4 children with 4 different women. He navigated accusations, paternity questions, jurisdiction fights, and sustained public commentary about his conduct as a father without making extended public statements addressing any of it directly. Whether that approach is viewed as private restraint or deliberate evasion depends entirely on who is evaluating it. The court gave its verdict, but public opinion operates on its own timeline and its own standards of evidence, and those two systems do not always reach the same conclusion. The broader public reaction to the entire sequence of events split hard. On one side, many fans and commentators framed Edwards' legal strategy as textbook smart maneuvering. The argument was simple. He had the resources to hire excellent legal counsel. His team identified that Georgia law would produce a different outcome than California law. They filed in Georgia, they fought consistently for that jurisdiction, and the courts ultimately agreed. From a purely strategic standpoint, the decision to pursue the case in a state with different child support guidelines and to fight every attempt to move the proceedings to California was a calculated move that produced a significantly different financial outcome. Legal observers pointed to the case as a clear illustration of why jurisdiction matters in high-stakes family law, and why wealthy athletes and entertainers often fight very hard over where their cases are heard. The state where a case is litigated can be just as determinative as the evidence presented in court, and this case became one of the clearest public examples of that reality in years. On the other side, Howard's framing of the situation as part of a broader pattern of absent fatherhood resonated with people who felt the public celebration of Edwards' legal victory ignored a more important set of questions. Whether a court orders $3,000 a month or $20,000 a month, the child still exists. The obligation to that child extends beyond monthly payments. And for people who connected with Howard's broader message about fathers choosing legal systems over presence, the specific dollar figure in the ruling felt less important than the character questions the entire situation raised. That division in public opinion did not resolve neatly, and it created a sustained conversation that kept the story alive well beyond the initial news cycle. There is also a broader pattern at work in situations like this that goes beyond any single athlete. Celebrity child support disputes have always attracted public attention, but the speed and scale at which they unfold now is categorically different from what it was even a decade ago. Court filings are obtained and published within hours. Live streams reach millions of people in real time. Reactions to reactions generate their own news cycles that can last as long as the original story. What might once have been a private legal proceeding between two parties becomes a nationwide referendum on topics that extend far beyond the specific legal question being decided. A family court proceeding became a multi-lane public conversation that touched on nearly every intersection of celebrity, accountability, and family that resonates most loudly in contemporary culture. The financial architecture of this case deserves one final examination because the numbers are genuinely instructive. The gap between what was sought and what was ordered is not a minor adjustment. If Howard had successfully kept the case in California and secured something closer to the $20,000 monthly figure she pursued, the annual obligation would have exceeded $240,000. The Georgia court ordered $3,222 per month, producing roughly $38,664 annually. The difference between those two annual figures is more than $200,000 per year. Compounded over the years until Aubrey ages out of the child support obligation, the cumulative gap between those two outcomes is extraordinary. That is the financial reality that made Edwards' jurisdictional strategy so significant, and why legal analysts and sports commentators spent so much time breaking down the Georgia versus California distinction. One judge, one state, one set of statutory guidelines, the same child, and a financial outcome that differs by a factor of 6 depending on which courtroom the case is heard in. That is the core lesson this case demonstrated, and it is why it will continue to be referenced whenever celebrity family law and jurisdictional strategy come up in the same conversation. Most people navigating family court do not have a legal team sophisticated enough to wage a multi-state jurisdictional fight for over a year. They do not have the financial resources to sustain that kind of litigation while making voluntary payments simultaneously. And they do not have the leverage to get a lump sum demand thrown out while also successfully blocking a parallel case in another state. Knowing how to navigate that system and having the resources to execute that strategy is itself an advantage that changes outcomes in ways that have nothing to do with the merits of either party's position. What ties every thread of this story together is the collision of elite professional success, family complexity, legal strategy, and public emotion that played out in real time across courtrooms and social media simultaneously. Anthony Edwards did not just win a courtroom argument, he won the fight over where the argument would be heard, which turned out to be the fight that mattered most. Aisha Howard did not just go live and react to losing. She used the platform the situation gave her to make a statement that reached beyond her own case and connected with people who had no direct stake in the legal proceedings. The marriage announcement landed at the exact moment the court victory was circulating at full volume, creating a convergence of storylines that felt like it could not have been scripted more precisely even if someone had tried. The public responded to all of it at once, sorting themselves into camps based on how they weighted legal outcomes against personal accountability. And the conversation that followed stretched across sports media, entertainment commentary, and genuine cultural debate about fathers, resources, and responsibility in a way that outlasted the original story by weeks. This case is going to be referenced for a long time because it illustrated one principle with complete clarity. Where a case is heard can determine what the case produces. Edwards' decision to fight for Georgia and shut down every California maneuver, including a $500,000 lump sum demand and the push for a public apology, changed the financial outcome in a way that will be felt for years. And the emotional reactions that follow, from Howard's live video to the marriage reveal and the viral moment it created, turned a courtroom victory into one of the most